AOC, look, I think she's very nice, but she's very low IQ. And we really don't need low IQ. Between her and Crockett, we're going to give them both an IQ test to see who comes out best. Now, I took my test. I took a real test at Walter Reed Medical Center, and I aced it. I got every one of all those questions right. Now it's time for them to take a test. Anyway, have a good time.
Joining me now, Professor Chris Freiman, economist and truth teller at West Virginia University's John Chambers College of Business and Economics. Chris, good to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I don't know. I didn't realize I was the big brain segment. I think maybe you made a mistake, but I don't know. I'll do my best.
Austin doesn't make mistakes, but if he does, then they go the place where the Epstein list is. So, Chris, glad to have you here. You're an economist. You're a truth teller. You're here to separate fact from fiction today. That's what we need. I want to know why you say that it is a myth that the poor are getting poorer in America, because everybody else is telling me that things are getting worse, right wing, left wing, this country is going to hell in a handbasket, and the poor are getting poorer, and the rich are getting richer. Tucker Carlson said it last week. Your reaction?
Yeah, thank you. I should say I'm actually a political philosopher who's just economically literate enough to get into trouble, but happy to dispel some economic myths. So yeah, so it is sort of interesting that you see this rhetoric on the right and the left, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, but it's just not true. So, so we're doing the big brain stuff, I guess. I'll get a little bit philosophical. So here's this question that we have to ask before we can answer the question, are the poor getting poorer? What does it mean to be poor? What does it mean to be rich? And basically what it means to be rich is to have the ability to consume a lot of stuff. And what it means to be poor is to lack that ability to consume a lot of stuff. And so once you understand what poverty is, this sort of inability to consume goods and services, you can see that in fact, the poor are getting richer over time. So the goods and services that, in particular, the American poor are able to consume today versus what they were able to consume in 1950 or 1980 or even the year 2000, the quantity and the quality has increased. And one way of kind of getting at this idea is by looking at what some economists call the time price of goods. So you just say, look, how many hours or how many minutes would the typical American have to work to buy a loaf of bread in 1980? And I'm just making up this number. I don't know what the number is off the top of my head, but the general gist of this is right. So in 1980, it might have cost the typical worker, 24 minutes. At work to buy a loaf of bread. Now it's something like 12 minutes. And so the paycheck that the American poor are receiving today versus 20 years ago, 40 years ago, just buys them a lot more stuff.
So people aren't getting poorer, but the media and politician needs them to feel poor to sell socialism, essentially.
So I think this is a really interesting question, is why is this narrative so popular? And my hunch is that, look, if you say the world is getting worse, the economy is getting worse, everybody is getting poorer except for a handful of billionaires, then it does make it an easier sell to say, look, we have to overhaul the system. We have to destroy the system. We have to implement something like democratic socialism. We have to tax billionaires out of existence, all this stuff. The system is horrible. Therefore, we have to destroy it and build something new. That kind of vision becomes a much easier sell if you can convince people that their lives are bad and getting worse.
So it's easier to justify bad policy if the public feels like they're victims?
Or just in general that their life is getting worse, and not just slightly worse, but much, much worse. And it's not the sort of thing that we can fix with small reforms. We have to tear down the entire system, destroy capitalism, implement socialism. If people actually knew that they were much richer today than they were 40 years ago, they might say, hey, this capitalist system is pretty good. Lots of room for improvement. I mean, I'm the first person to say there are lots of ways we could make the situation better, but we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Capitalism is great. It makes everyone richer. We could do more to make our system more capitalist, but the solution is to reform capitalism, make it a bit more free, deregulate all these sorts of things that I'm sure you know about, rather than throw out the entire system in favor of socialism.
Well, I hear a lot of right wingers these days actually crossing over and saying things like Bernie Sanders is actually right, and that they may not agree with the left on social issues, but what I hear from Tucker Carlson, Peter Navarro, Howard Lutnick, and Josh Hawley, and many others on the right that these days is that Bernie Sanders, AOC, they're actually right. They're not actually raising the minimum wage high enough. And one of the things that they point to, and this has a lot of right-wing Zoomers, especially beating the drum of central planning, is that no one can afford houses anymore. They talk about how earlier generations used to be able to purchase a house with a single person's income, and they could take care of an entire household and afford a really nice house. And now the American dream, literally home ownership, is out of reach for many people, not able to purchase their houses until they turn 90 years old. And that's why so many young people, including right wingers, are embracing more central planning ideals and blaming shadowy conspiracies like BlackRock. How would you react or respond to that?
So that's a great question. It's an important issue, and I agree that rising housing costs it's a monumental problem. I mean, everybody's worried about it, and rightly so. And my initial thought is to just give a very simple kind of thought experiment. So if, the price of, I'll just stick with the bread example. If the price of bread started skyrocketing, how would we expect self-interested bakers to respond? They would say, oh, wow, bread's really expensive. I can make tons and tons of money by exploiting this, baking more bread and selling it, reaping tons and tons of profit. Now, of course, if lots of bakers are doing this, they say, all right, I'm going to take advantage of the rising price of bread. I'm going to bake more bread. I'm going to sell it, make money. Well, then the supply of bread goes up, and eventually the price of bread goes back down. This is just, Econ 101 type stuff. And so the question is, why don't we see this dynamic in the housing market? So you would say, look, developers say, housing prices are skyrocketing. I can make a killing by building more housing, get a ton of profit. Everyone's thinking the same thing. As a result, the supply of housing goes up, the price comes back down, and now housing becomes more affordable. So the question is, why isn't the housing market responding in the way that, we would expect the bread market or other sorts of bread markets to respond to a rise in prices? And the short answer is the government just makes it very, very difficult to build. And there are all sorts of examples of this, but people talk a lot, and rightly so to my mind, about the NIMBY movement, where you want to build housing, you want to build apartments, you want to build condos, whatever. And, you have to get rounds and rounds of community input and community approval, and there are zoning regulations, all these sorts of things. It's just very, very difficult due to the regulatory environment to build more housing. So I would say people are right to be worried about this. The price of housing should be going down, but the way to solve this problem is to just let the market do its magic in the same way we let it do its magic when it comes to things like groceries or cars or anything else.
I'm speaking to Chris Freiman this morning. He's debunking some popular economic myths. We just went through the first economic myth is that the poor are getting poorer in the United States. The second myth, let's move on. Unions gave us weekends and the 40-hour work week. You say that's a myth.
Yes, that is a myth. So, there are interesting surveys of economic historians, and you say, who or what is primarily responsible for the shortened work week? And the vast majority of them say economic growth, not unions. And you can actually, again, there's all sorts of interesting data on this. But here again, I would give you a thought experiment. Well, I guess this is an issue not just about work hours, but also sort of wages. So there's this idea that unions are primarily responsible for the increase in workers' wages. And if you have more wages, then you don't have to work quite as long to afford basic necessities, this sort of thing, and so you can take more time off. So an employer is not going to pay an employee more than their marginal product. So in other words, if an employee only brings $20 of value per hour to an employer, they're not going to pay that employee $21 per hour because they would just be losing money on the deal. So it could be the case that certain employees are underpaid. So maybe the employee who brings $20 per hour to the employer is only making $18 an hour. And maybe unions, through pressure and bargaining and things like that, could bring that person's wages up a little bit. But they will never be able to push that worker's wage above $20 an hour, because no employer is going to pay somebody who only brings in $20 an hour $21 an hour. They're not going to lose money on the deal. So I do think unions can, make some sort of a difference on the margin. They can, improve workers' conditions a little bit. But really, what drives higher wages is making workers more productive, and accelerating economic growth. And then once workers are more productive, and this sort of goes back to the point I was making earlier about the time price of goods, if you can afford your day's calories on 1 hour of work as opposed to 5 hours of work, then you just need fewer hours per week to afford everything that you want to buy. And so you can have, a shorter work week and still get by. So unions might be a little bit of a help in terms of pushing up workers' wages and reducing their hours. But really what helps is making workers more productive, enabling them to afford more, enabling them to take more time off.
I love this. I'm speaking to Chris Freiman this morning, his first time on the Wake Up America show. He's a professor. He's debunking some major economic myths. Make sure you clip this segment and share it with your socialist friends if you still have any, and they haven't completely denaturalized you from your families and quit speaking to you like so many have. Social spending is decreasing. This is the myth, right? The third myth, that social spending is decreasing. The left was freaking out about cuts to Medicaid from the big beautiful bill. Is social spending decreasing, Chris?
No, in fact, it's quite the opposite. So it's been increasing steadily for a very long time. And the primary driver of this is entitlement programs. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on. If you just look at the long-term trend of the last century or so, social spending in the United States, and not just the United States, but almost everywhere, it's been increasing. There are a variety of reasons for this, but when people talk about, an austerity program, they talk about this not just in the US, but people like European socialists are very concerned about austerity in Europe. It's just not the case that social spending has decreased. When it comes to the percentage of social spending social spending as a percentage of GDP, that's been increasing as well. So we spend more money on entitlements now than we ever have. And, this is the sort of thing, too, that's like easy enough to see when you just look at like federal spending every single year. It just goes up and up and up. Now, of course, not all of that is social spending. Some of it is defense spending and things like that. But the vast majority of it is entitlements. And this is actually another myth, as long as we're talking about myths. Social spending radically outpaces defense spending. So, we could argue about how much we should be spending on defense, but people will say things like, oh, if we didn't spend this much money on defense, we would have so much more money for Social Security or feeding the poor, SNAP benefits. Maybe we spend too much on defense, but we just spend far, far more on entitlement programs. Like that's a much bigger driver than the military.
We spend more money on interest payments than we do on our national defense in this country. And finally, okay, this is the golden calf, Chris, the fourth myth. Taxing billionaires will fix everything. If we just raise taxes on the guy who sends us our next day packages, our Amazon Prime, if we just raise taxes on the people who are allowing me to stream on this social network live to a dozen platforms, if we just raise taxes on all the people that are making it possible for you and I to have this conversation right now, then that will solve our economic problems. Chris, you say that's a myth.
Yeah, this is my favorite myth to debunk, because I genuinely do enjoy defending billionaires, because like you're saying, they may like. I'm old enough to remember life before Amazon. Amazon is incredible. It has made my life like so much better. It's really amazing. And so sometimes people say, oh, we have to tax billionaires to increase revenue. But then there's almost this punitive dimension to some of the arguments where it's like we have to punish billionaires for becoming billionaires and providing us with all these goods and services that we like to buy. So it's simply not true that we could radically increase our tax revenues by dramatically increasing taxes on billionaires. So there's this kind of funny story where there was some op-ed where an economist said, look, if we confiscated every dollar from every American billionaire, that would not be enough to run the government for more than 8 months. It was every single penny. And then there was a fact check. And they said, well, no, actually, this is not true. We could, in fact, run the government for 10 months. It's like, oh, okay. But so the upshot is, even if, which is not true, even if the billionaires had all of their wealth in gold coins, like Scrooge McDuck, they're swimming around in the Scrooge McDuck pool. And then like, all right, then like the IRS comes in, takes all those gold coins. That is not enough to fund the government at its current levels of spending for an entire year. And now this actually understates the problem because, of course, they're not swimming around in gold coins like Scrooge McDuck. So if you confiscated all that wealth, you wouldn't actually get, however many billions or trillions you think you might. And that's not even to mention the fact that the long-term incentive effects would be completely disastrous. So why, if you have the idea for the next Amazon, would you try to actually implement that idea, take the risk, work the hours, if you knew that once you created the next Amazon, all of the wealth that you accrued from that would just be confiscated by the government? So, maybe we could increase taxes on billionaires a little bit and get a little bit more revenue. But this idea that we're going to fund the democratic socialist government of the United States in the future by taxing billionaires out of existence is simply not true.
Yes, and please, kids, do not dive head first into gold coins. That would kill you.
It always struck me as a weird pastime. Like, what isn't a pool with water better than, like, if I'm a billionaire, I'm swimming in water. I'm not swimming in gold.
It says no one shall besmirch the memory of Scrooge McDuck on my show. Chris Freiman, where can people follow you? Read your work, your writing? Do you have a Substack, an X page? Where should people go?
Yeah, so you could follow me on X at CA Freiman, so CA and my last name. I also do Substack occasionally at Freiman, FREI .substack.com. And actually, if I could, it's a little premature, but I got a book coming out with a friend of mine. She's a philosopher at the University of Richmond, Jess Flanagan, called Libertarianism, the Basics. Fingers crossed that's going to be out in October. You could have us on the show. I don't know.
Yeah, you better reach back out, Chris, if I forget, because we're going to have you back because you're literally talking to the audience for that kind of promotion. So
I am happy to self-promote.
Yeah, when that happens, come back in October. We'll talk about your book. Chris, this was great. Debunking 4 major economic myths. We're going to cut this up, share it out there, and hopefully more people will learn and not follow people like Zora and Mamdani off a cliff. You have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Thank you. You too.
There we go. Have a great day.